wagon jolted hard over a stone, and Elena Whitmore nearly bit through her own tongue. Her wrists were tied in front of her, the rope rough and biting into her skin, and the two guards riding beside the wagon had not spoken one kind word to her since dawn. She was being taken to the Alpha King, and everyone in her village already whispered that she would not be coming back. Elena kept her eyes forward. She would not let them see her shake. Behind her, the only home she had ever known grew smaller and smaller, swallowed by mist and pine trees, until it disappeared completely. Nobody had come to say goodbye, not her cousins, not the pack elders who had chosen her name from a list as though she were nothing more than a chore to check off. 3 days earlier, she had been kneeling in the meeting hall while the elders argued over her future, as though she were not even in the room. Elder Garrick had been the one to say her name first. He did not look at her when he said it, only shuffled his papers and cleared his throat, as if speaking the words quickly would make them hurt less. Nobody objected. Nobody offered themselves in her place. A young woman named Della, who had once called herself Elena's friend, had simply looked down at the floor and said nothing at all. That silence had told Elena everything she needed to know about her place among her own people. She was tolerated, not valued. Convenient, not cherished. And when the moment came to decide whose blood would be spilled to save the rest, her name rose to the top of the list, without a single voice raised against it. "You should be grateful," one of the guards muttered, not looking at her. "The king could have sent an army to burn your pack to the ground. Instead, he only asked for one life." Elena tightened her jaw and stared at the horizon, refusing to let the guard's words settle into her chest. Gratitude was the last thing she felt. She felt hollow, scraped clean of everything, except the steady, grinding fear of not knowing exactly how her life would end, only that it would end soon, in a place she had never seen, among people who owed her nothing. What was there to say? Her pack had broken the treaty. Hunters from her territory had crossed into the Alpha King's land and taken game that belonged to his people, a direct violation of an agreement that had kept the peace for over a decade. The elders panicked. They needed someone to send as a peace offering, someone the pack could afford to lose, and Elena, an Omega with no parents left to fight for her and no mate to claim her, was the easiest name to write down. She had cried the first night after they told her. Not from fear of dying exactly, but from the quiet, aching realization that her own people had decided, without hesitation, that her life was worth less than theirs. After that first night, she stopped crying. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her fall apart, even from a distance. The road to the Alpha King's territory grew steeper as the day wore on. The trees became darker, older, twisted with age, and the guards grew more silent the closer they came to the border. Elena had heard the stories about Cade Ashworth since she was a child. He was said to be the strongest alpha in 3 generations, a king who had taken his throne young and never lost a single battle since. Some said he had no mercy left in him at all, that his heart had turned to stone the day his own parents were murdered by a rival pack. Elena had always assumed those stories were exaggerated, the kind of tales parents told to frighten children into obedience. Now, riding toward his castle with her hands bound and her future erased, she was not so sure anymore. By mid-afternoon, the towers of the Ashworth Castle rose into view, dark stones spearing up through the clouds like something out of an old nightmare. Elena's stomach turned to ice. The wagon slowed as they crossed a bridge over a wide, churning river, and guards in black uniforms lined the path, watching her with expressions she could not read. "Word travels fast," the second guard said quietly to the first, as if Elena were not sitting right there. "They say the king has been in a foul mood for days. Ever since the messenger arrived asking for a peace offering, he's barely spoken to anyone." "Then let's hope she doesn't make it worse," the first guard replied. Elena swallowed hard. She thought of her small room back home, of the garden she used to tend behind the cottage, of the life she had built for herself despite having no one. She thought of all the mornings she woke up and told herself that someday, somehow, things would get better. She had never imagined that instead, her story would end here, in a stranger's kingdom, paying for a crime she never committed. The wagon came to a stop in the castle's outer courtyard. Elena's legs felt unsteady, as the guards pulled her down onto the cold stone ground. She stumbled, but caught herself before she fell, refusing to let them see her weak. A tall woman in a dark green cloak approached, her face unreadable, her eyes sweeping over Elena, the way someone might examine livestock before a sale. "This is her?" the woman asked. Yes, Councilwoman Vale, the first guard answered. Sent from the Whitmore pack as demanded. The woman, who Elena would later learn was named Priscilla Vale, one of the king's most trusted advisors, studied her for a long moment. There was something almost like pity in her expression, quickly hidden behind a mask of formality. Bring her inside. The king wishes to see her immediately. Elena's heart pounded so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She had expected to be thrown into some dark cell to wait, to have hours or even days before facing whatever punishment awaited her. Instead, the inside of the castle was more beautiful and more frightening than anything Elena had ever seen. Towering ceilings, dark wooden beams, portraits of stern-faced ancestors staring down from every wall. Guards stood at every corner, silent as statues, their eyes following her as she passed. She kept her chin lifted, even as her knees threatened to buckle beneath her. Priscilla led her down a long corridor, lit by flickering torches, past rows of closed doors and hushed side rooms, where Elena caught glimpses of clerks and servants freezing mid-motion to watch her pass. A young maid carrying a stack of folded linens actually stopped and pressed herself against the wall, eyes wide, as if Elena were something dangerous rather than something doomed. Word of her arrival had clearly spread through the entire castle already. Is it true he executed the last messenger who brought him bad news? Elena asked quietly, unable to stop the question from slipping out. Priscilla's mouth twitched, almost a smile, almost not. The king does not execute messengers for bringing news. He is not cruel for the sake of cruelty. He is simply exact. He does not forgive broken agreements, and he does not forget them either. That is why your pack's elders should have thought more carefully before letting their hunters cross the border. The words stung more than Elena expected. She had not crossed any border. She had not stolen anything. Yet here she was, paying the price for choices that were never hers to make, walking toward a fate decided entirely by other people's mistakes. They stopped before two massive wooden doors, carved with the symbol of a wolf baring its teeth beneath a crown. Straighten your shoulders, Priscilla said, not unkindly. Whatever happens in there, do not show him fear. Alphas can smell it, and it will not help you. Elena nodded, though she wasn't sure her body would obey the command. The doors swung open, revealing a throne room so vast it seemed to swallow all sound. At the far end, seated on a throne carved from black stone, sat a man who radiated more raw power than anyone Elena had ever encountered in her life. Even from this distance, she could feel it, an invisible weight pressing down on the room, the kind of presence that made every wolf inside want to lower their eyes. He wore no crown, no jewels, nothing to announce his status beyond the way every single person in the room seemed to orbit around him, like he was the sun, and they were merely planets caught in his gravity. This was Cade Ashworth, the Alpha King, the man who held her life in his hands. The room itself seemed built to remind visitors of their smallness. Enormous stained glass windows rose along both walls, depicting old battles and older wolves, casting colored light across the stone floor in patterns that shifted every time a cloud passed outside. Banners bearing the Ashworth crest hung from the rafters, dark red and black, stirring faintly in a draft Elena could not locate. The air smelled of candle wax and old parchment, and underneath it, something sharper, something that made every instinct in her body want to run. She noticed the other people in the room, only in fragments. A cluster of nobles near the eastern wall watched her with open curiosity. Two guards stood at the base of the throne, hands resting on the hilts of their swords. An older man near the front, dressed in fine robes, whispered something to the woman beside him, both of their eyes following Elena's every step. Elena forced her feet to keep moving, one step at a time, down the long stretch of red carpet that led to his throne. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, nobles and guards lining the walls, whispering to one another behind gloved hands. She ignored all of them. She fixed her gaze somewhere just below the king's chin, unwilling to meet his eyes directly, afraid of what might happen if she did. When she finally reached the base of the steps leading up to his throne, the guards forced her down onto her knees. The stone floor was freezing, and pain shot up through her legs, but Elena refused to make a sound. This is the offering from the Whitmore pack? The king's voice was deep, low, and carried easily across the enormous room, without him needing to raise it at all. Yes, my king, Priscilla answered from somewhere behind Elena, sent as recompense for the violation of the Northern Hunting Treaty. Silence stretched over the throne room, so thick, Elena could hear her own heartbeat hammering in her ears. She sensed movement above her, and against every instinct screaming at her to stay still, something made her lift her head. Their eyes met. And in that single instant, everything in Elena's world went perfectly, terrifyingly silent. Cade Ashworth had not moved. His hands, resting loosely on the arms of his throne, went rigid, fingers curling slowly into the stone, as though he were bracing himself against something only he could feel. His golden eyes, which a moment ago had held nothing but cold indifference, now burned with an intensity that made every hair on Elena's arms rise. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing against her skin like a physical weight. She did not understand what was happening, only that something had shifted, something enormous and invisible, and that every wolf in the room sensed it too. Whispers rippled through the gathered nobles. Priscilla, standing a few paces behind Elena, went utterly still, her sharp eyes darting between the king and the trembling Omega kneeling before him. "My king?" Priscilla said carefully, taking half a step forward. "Shall the guards proceed with the sentencing?" Cade did not answer. He rose from his throne slowly, deliberately, and the movement alone sent a ripple of unease through the entire hall. Guards straightened. Nobles fell silent. Nobody dared to speak while their king descended the steps of his own throne, something he almost never did in front of the court. Elena's heart slammed against her ribs so hard she thought everyone in the room must be able to hear it. She kept her eyes down now, terrified of what she had seen in his face, terrified that whatever had passed between them had made things worse rather than better. She had expected fury. She had expected judgment. She had not expected this strange, suffocating silence, or the way his footsteps seemed to grow louder with every step he took toward her. He stopped only a few feet away, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, close enough to smell cedar and rain, and something else beneath it, something that made her chest ache in a way she could not explain. She kept her gaze fixed on the floor, on the toes of his dark leather boots, refusing to look up again. "Look at me," he said. His voice was quieter now than it had been before, but it carried an authority that left no room for hesitation. Elena's body responded before her mind could catch up, lifting her chin, meeting his eyes once more, despite every instinct screaming at her not to. The moment their gazes locked again, she felt it too, an invisible thread pulling taut somewhere deep inside her chest, so powerful it nearly knocked the breath from her lungs. "What is your name?" he asked. "Elena," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Elena Whitmore, my king." Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. He studied her for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes tracing over her features, as though searching for something he could not quite believe was real. Behind them, the murmurs among the nobles grew louder, more urgent, until Cade suddenly turned, sweeping his gaze across the entire hall with an expression that silenced the room instantly. "Leave," he said, "all of you." The command cracked through the air like a whip. For a heartbeat, nobody moved, too stunned by the abrupt order to react. Then chaos broke loose in slow, careful motion, nobles bowing hastily and shuffling toward the exits, guards exchanging confused glances, before falling into formation to escort them out. Priscilla lingered a moment longer than the others, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied the king's rigid posture and the strange tension radiating off him. "My king is everything." "Priscilla." His voice was low, controlled, but carried an unmistakable warning. "Not now." She hesitated only a second longer, before bowing her head and following the others toward the enormous doors. One by one, the nobles and guards filed out of the throne room, casting curious, uneasy glances back at the king and the kneeling Omega he had just ordered to remain. The heavy wooden doors groaned shut behind the last of them, sealing Elena inside the vast, echoing hall alone with the most powerful and feared alpha in the kingdom. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Elena remained frozen on her knees, unsure whether standing without permission would be seen as disrespect, or whether staying down would be interpreted as weakness. Her mind raced through every possible explanation for what had just happened, and none of them made sense. Alphas did not clear entire throne rooms for prisoners. Kings did not order silence and privacy before delivering judgment on a peace offering meant to satisfy an entire kingdom's fury, unless something else was happening, something Elena did not yet have the words to understand. Cade finally exhaled, a long, unsteady breath that seemed to cost him considerable effort to release. He ran a hand through his dark hair, turning away from her briefly, his shoulders squared as though bracing against an invisible blow. When he turned back to face her, his expression had shifted into something guarded, something carefully controlled, though his eyes still held that same burning intensity from before. "Stand up," he said quietly. Elena hesitated, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "My king?" I said stand. There was no cruelty in his tone this time, only a strange, restrained patience that confused her even more than his earlier fury would have. She rose slowly, her legs stiff and aching from kneeling on the cold stone, her wrists still bound in front of her. Cade's gaze dropped to the rope circling her skin, and something dark passed behind his eyes. Without a word, he stepped forward and, with a single sharp motion, severed the rope with a small blade she had not even seen him draw. The bindings fell away, and Elena rubbed at the raw, reddened skin beneath, too stunned to speak. No one had shown her a single moment of gentleness since the elders had announced her fate 3 days ago. She did not know what to make of this one. "You were sent here to die," Cade said, his voice low, almost as though he were speaking the words aloud, to convince himself of something. That was the arrangement. Your pack's elders violated the treaty, and the price for that violation was a life. Elena's throat tightened. "Yes, my king. And yet." He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, and made it impossible to do so at the same time. "I find that I cannot bring myself to collect that price." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and unexplainable. Elena searched his expression for some hidden trap, some cruel twist waiting to reveal itself, but found only genuine, unsettled confusion mirroring her own. Whatever was happening, it seemed the Alpha King understood it no better than she did. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Neither do I," Cade admitted, and for the first time since she had entered the throne room, he sounded almost human, almost uncertain. Nothing like the merciless legend she had grown up fearing. "But I intend to find out." Elena wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how exposed she felt standing alone in the enormous hall with him, the echo of their voices swallowed by the high stone ceilings. "If you don't intend to kill me," she said carefully, choosing each word as though it might detonate, "then what happens to my pack? The treaty demanded a life. If you spare me, will you send soldiers instead?" It was a fair question, and one that had been gnawing at her since the moment he ordered the room cleared. Sparing her meant nothing, if it only shifted the punishment onto the people back home, the ones who had already decided her life meant less than theirs. Cade's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked almost surprised that she would ask such a thing while her own life still hung in uncertainty. "You would ask me that," he said slowly, "before asking what will happen to you?" "They're still my pack," Elena said, lifting her chin despite the tremor in her voice. "Whatever they did to me, they're still my people." Something shifted in his expression, subtle but unmistakable, as though her answer had told him something important about who she was. "The treaty will be honored differently," he said finally. "No further blood will be demanded from your pack, but do not mistake my restraint for forgiveness of what they did to secure their peace by sending you here to die in their place." Elena said nothing, unsure whether relief or shame was the stronger feeling twisting through her chest. Relief that her people would not suffer further, and shame that some small, wounded part of her had hoped, just for a moment, that he might punish them the way they had so easily condemned her. Cade studied her a moment longer, then turned toward the enormous doors and called out a name. Within seconds, a guard entered, a young man with cautious eyes who clearly had been waiting just outside for instruction. "Prepare the East Wing chambers," Cade said, "the ones overlooking the garden. See that she has proper clothing, food, and anything else she requires." The guard's eyes widened slightly, before he caught himself, and bowed. "At once, my king." He hesitated only a fraction of a second, glancing at Elena with poorly concealed confusion, before turning and disappearing back through the doors. Elena stared after him, then back at Cade, her mind struggling to reconcile what she was hearing. "Chambers," she repeated slowly. "Not a cell." "Did you expect a cell?" "I expected a grave," Elena said before she could stop herself, and immediately regretted the bluntness of it, bracing for anger that never came. Instead, something almost like pain crossed Cade's features, quickly hidden behind the same guarded expression he had worn since ordering the room emptied. You will not find one here, he said quietly. Not while I am deciding what all of this means. And what does it mean? Elena pressed, emboldened now by the strange gentleness beneath his controlled exterior. Why does it matter to you what happens to me? Cade did not answer right away. He turned from her, walking a few paces toward the towering stained glass windows, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, as though physically restraining himself from something. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, almost reluctant. There are things about our kind that even I do not fully understand until they happen. What passed between us, the moment you lifted your eyes to mine, was not something I chose, Elena Whitmore. It simply happened, and now I must decide what to do with it. Elena's chest tightened at the sound of her own name in his mouth, and though she still did not understand what he meant, some instinctive part of her recognized the weight behind his words, the way they seemed to matter far more than he was willing to explain outright. I don't know what that means, she admitted quietly. Not yet, Cade said, turning back to face her, his golden eyes unreadable once more. But you will. He called for the guard once more, and this time a woman entered, older, with kind eyes and steady hands, introduced only as Margaret. Escort her to the East Chambers, Cade instructed. Treat her as an honored guest, not a prisoner. Margaret's eyebrows lifted slightly at the phrase, but she said nothing, only nodded, and gestured for Elena to follow. As Elena turned to leave, she glanced back once at the Alpha King, still standing near the towering windows, his expression unreadable in the colored light filtering through the glass. He did not look away, and neither did she, not until Margaret gently touched her arm and guided her through the doors. The corridor outside the throne room was crowded with nobles and guards pretending not to have been listening at the doors, their conversations dying instantly as Elena and Margaret emerged. Priscilla stood near the front of the gathered crowd, her sharp eyes locking onto Elena with open, calculating curiosity, before she pushed past the others and slipped back into the throne room, clearly determined to get answers directly from the king himself. Inside, Cade was still standing by the windows when Priscilla entered, closing the heavy doors firmly behind her. She did not bother with formalities. You cleared the entire court for an Omega sent as a peace offering, she said. You cut her bindings. You gave her chambers instead of a cell. My king, I have advised you for 11 years, and I have never once seen you behave this way. Cade did not turn to face her immediately. She is my mate, he said finally, the words feeling strange and enormous in his mouth, as though speaking them aloud made the impossible suddenly, terrifyingly real. Priscilla went very still. Your fated mate. Yes. The bond recognized her the moment she looked at you. It was not a question. Priscilla had served 2 generations of Ashworth kings and understood the old stories better than almost anyone left in the castle. She knew what the bond meant, how rare it was, how it had not been witnessed among royalty in nearly a century. Yes, Cade said again, quieter this time. Priscilla exhaled slowly, pressing a hand to her temple as the political weight of the situation settled over her. My king, her pack violated a treaty. The entire kingdom expects that girl to be punished, not elevated. If word spreads that you have claimed the very peace offering meant to satisfy that debt, there will be nobles who see it as weakness. Some may see it as an insult to every pack that has honored their agreements with us. I am aware, Cade said, his voice hardening slightly, which is why nothing has been decided yet. She remains a guest, nothing more, for now. For now, Priscilla repeated, studying him carefully. And when the bond demands more than that, as it inevitably will? Cade did not answer, because he did not have an answer to give her. The truth was that he had felt many things in his life as Alpha King. Grief sharp enough to cut him open the night his parents died. Fury hot enough to end wars. Exhaustion so deep it settled into his bones after years of ruling alone. But nothing had prepared him for the moment Elena Whitmore lifted her eyes to his, and something ancient and undeniable clicked into place inside his chest. A certainty more powerful than any command he had ever given or received. He had spent his entire reign believing the mate bond was a story told to comfort young wolves, a fairy tale meant to make the burden of leadership feel less lonely. He had never expected to feel it himself, and he certainly had never expected to feel it toward a girl his own court had sent to be executed. Meanwhile, in the East Wing, Elena followed Margaret through a maze of corridors that grew more beautiful with every turn. tapestries depicting scenes of hunting wolves and moonlit forests, polished floors that reflected candlelight like still water. She said nothing during the walk, too overwhelmed to form questions, though Margaret occasionally glanced at her with an expression Elena could not quite place, something between sympathy and quiet fascination. "Here we are," Margaret finally said, stopping before a set of tall doors carved with a pattern of climbing vines. She pushed them open to reveal a room larger than Elena's entire cottage back home, a bed draped in soft blue linens, a balcony overlooking gardens bursting with late summer flowers, a fireplace already crackling with warmth despite the mild afternoon. Elena stood frozen in the doorway, unable to reconcile this room with the fate she had prepared herself for during the entire journey here. "This can't be right," she murmured. "The king's orders were very clear," Margaret said gently, stepping inside to draw back the curtains further. "I've served this castle for 30 years, dear. I have never seen him give an order quite like this one." Elena wrapped her arms around herself again, staring at the beautiful, impossible room, and felt something she had not expected to feel since leaving her pack 3 days ago. Not relief exactly, and not comfort either, but something sharper, more unsettling. A dawning, uneasy suspicion that whatever had happened between her and the Alpha King in that throne room was only the beginning of something far bigger than either of them yet understood. That night, Elena sat on the edge of the enormous bed, still fully dressed, unable to bring herself to sleep in a place that felt more like a trap than a shelter. A tray of food had been brought to her room an hour earlier: roasted meat, fresh bread, a small bowl of berries, all of it smelling wonderful, and looking completely untouched on the small table by the window. She had not eaten a single bite. "You should try to have something," Margaret said gently, returning to check on her for the 3rd time that evening. "You've had a very long journey." "How do I know it isn't poisoned?" Elena asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them, sharper than she intended. Margaret did not seem offended by the question. If anything, her expression softened further, as though she understood exactly why a girl who had arrived expecting execution might struggle to trust a gift of warm bread. "If the king wanted you dead," she said carefully, "he would not have needed to poison you, dear. He could have simply let the sentencing proceed this afternoon, in front of the entire court, exactly as everyone expected." The logic settled uncomfortably in Elena's chest, because it was true, and true things had a way of being harder to argue against than lies. Still, she left the tray untouched for another hour, staring instead out the balcony doors at the darkening gardens below, replaying the moment their eyes had met over and over in her mind, searching for some explanation that made sense. "Margaret," she finally asked, when the older woman returned once more with fresh candles, "what does it mean when a wolf recognizes someone as their mate?" Margaret paused in the doorway, studying Elena carefully before setting the candles down. "You truly don't know?" "I've heard stories," Elena admitted, growing up, "but my pack never spoke of it seriously. We were taught the mate bond was mostly legend, something that happened to a lucky few generations ago, not something real people actually experienced anymore." "It's real," Margaret said quietly, taking a seat in the chair near the fire, her hands folding in her lap. "Rare, especially among wolves of high standing, but very real. When two fated mates meet, the bond announces itself instantly and undeniably. It isn't something either person can control or choose. Some describe it as recognizing a piece of their own soul in another person for the very first time." Elena's stomach twisted. "And the king believes that I am his." "I do not know exactly what the king believes," Margaret said carefully. "Only what I have witnessed with my own eyes today, which is a man who has ruled this kingdom alone for 6 years, without warmth, without softness, suddenly ordering an entire court emptied, and a condemned prisoner moved into the finest guest chambers in the castle. Whatever conclusion you draw from that, dear, I imagine you are not far from the truth." Elena said nothing for a long while, staring at the flickering candlelight, trying to reconcile everything she had been taught about fate and bonds with the terrifying, impossible reality unfolding around her. If the stories were true, if this bond was real and unbreakable, then everything about her situation had changed in ways she could not yet fully comprehend. She was no longer simply a prisoner awaiting judgment. She was something else entirely, something that made even the Alpha King's most trusted advisor uneasy. "What happens now?" Elena finally asked. Margaret's expression grew more careful, more measured. That, dear, depends entirely on what the king decides to do about it. Bonds like this one are not simple things, especially not for a man in his position. There will be advisors who see you as an opportunity, and others who will see you as a threat to be removed before the bond can be acted upon at all. The words settled over Elena like a fresh wave of cold water, driving away the small, dangerous flicker of hope that had begun forming somewhere in her chest since the throne room. Removed. The word carried weight, implication, danger she had not fully considered until now. She had assumed the greatest threat to her life had ended the moment Cade Ashworth chose not to execute her. She was beginning to understand that it may have only just begun, in a different, more complicated form. She barely slept that night, drifting in and out of uneasy dreams filled with her pack's meeting hall, Elder Garrick's voice reading her name aloud, and beneath it all, a pair of burning golden eyes she could not stop seeing every time she closed her own. The following morning, the council chamber was already tense before Cade even entered the room. 6 advisors sat around the long stone table, including Priscilla and an older man named Edmund Cross, who had served as the kingdom's treasurer for over 2 decades and rarely hesitated to speak his mind, regardless of who might be offended by it. "My king," Edmund began, the moment Cade took his seat at the head of the table. "Forgive my bluntness, but the entire castle is already talking about the Omega girl. Guards, servants, even the stable hands. If word reaches the neighboring packs that you have spared and sheltered the very offering meant to settle a treaty violation, it will send a message we cannot afford." "What message would that be?" Cade asked, his voice deceptively calm. "That the Ashworth throne can be manipulated," Edmund said carefully. "That if a pack breaks an agreement and sends a pretty enough face to pay the price, punishment can be avoided entirely." Cade's expression darkened, though he kept his temper carefully contained. The girl had no part in violating that treaty. She was a convenient scapegoat, chosen by cowardly elders, unwilling to sacrifice anyone who actually mattered to them. "Perhaps," Priscilla cut in gently, before the conversation could sour further. "But Edmund's concern is not entirely unfounded, my king. Whatever the reasons behind your decision, the political optics remain the same. Other packs are watching closely to see how firmly you enforce the treaties that keep this kingdom stable." Cade said nothing for a long moment, his jaw tight, his hands folded in front of him on the table. He had known this conversation was coming from the moment he ordered the throne room emptied the day before, and yet hearing his advisors speak so plainly about Elena, as though she were merely a political liability rather than a person, rather than his mate, made something protective and fierce coil tightly in his chest. "I have not yet decided what will be done regarding the girl's status," he said finally, choosing his words with deliberate care. "In the meantime, she remains under my protection as a guest of this castle. I would advise each of you to remember that she came here at great cost to herself, sent by people who valued her life less than their own comfort. Whatever judgment this council wishes to pass, I suggest directing it toward the elders who orchestrated her sacrifice, not the girl who had no say in the matter." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Edmund did not look entirely convinced, but he inclined his head slightly, unwilling to push the matter further in front of the others. Priscilla studied Cade carefully, clearly reading far more into his careful, measured words than the rest of the council seemed to notice. After the meeting concluded and the advisors filed out one by one, Cade found himself walking toward the east wing, without fully deciding to do so, his feet carrying him there, almost against his own will. He told himself it was simply prudent to check on the situation personally, to gauge her state of mind after the shock of the previous day, though some quieter, more honest part of him understood it was something else entirely pulling him toward her chambers. He found her on the balcony when Margaret let him in, standing at the railing overlooking the gardens, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, still wearing the same travel-worn dress from the day before. She startled slightly when she noticed him, straightening quickly, though she did not kneel this time, and something about that small act of defiance made the corner of his mouth twitch, almost a smile. "My king," she said carefully. "Cade," he corrected, surprising even himself with the offer. "You may use my name when we are not in front of the court." Elena studied him for a moment, clearly uncertain whether to trust the invitation. "Why are you here?" "I came to see how you were settling in," he said, which was true, if incomplete, "and to ask you some questions, if you're willing to answer them." "Interrogation," Elena said flatly, though there was no real fear in the word this time. only weary understanding. If you prefer to call it that, Cade said, stepping closer to the balcony railing beside her, close enough that she caught that same scent of cedar and rain she had noticed in the throne room. Tell me about your pack, not the elders who sent you here, you. Elena blinked, clearly caught off guard by the request. Nobody had asked her to talk about herself in a very long time, not without some ulterior motive attached to the question. There isn't much to tell, she said slowly. My parents died when I was young. I grew up mostly on my own, tending a small garden behind my cottage, keeping to myself. I was never someone anyone paid much attention to, until they needed someone expendable. Something tightened in Cade's expression at the word expendable, though he said nothing, only listened as she continued speaking, slowly, cautiously, about her garden, about the herbs she grew, about the quiet, solitary life she had built for herself despite having no one to share it with. And for the first time since arriving at the castle, Elena found herself talking, not because she was forced to, but because something about the way he listened, fully and without judgment, made her want to keep going. Over the following days, Cade returned to the East Wing often, sometimes with a genuine reason, a question about her comfort, an update on arrangements being made, and other times with no real excuse at all beyond wanting to see her. Elena noticed the pattern quickly, though she said nothing about it, partly because she did not fully trust it yet, and partly because some small, guarded part of her had begun looking forward to those visits more than she wanted to admit. One afternoon, he found her kneeling in the castle gardens, her sleeves pushed up, hands buried in the soil around a bed of wilting herbs that the castle gardeners had apparently neglected for months. She had asked Margaret for permission to tend them, unable to stand watching healthy plants struggle when she knew exactly how to save them. The gardeners will be relieved, Cade said, watching her work from a few steps away. Nobody here has had much success keeping that particular bed alive. Elena glanced up at him, smudges of dirt on her hands, a strand of hair falling loose across her face. It just needed proper drainage, and less shade than someone planted it in. It isn't complicated, once you understand what it needs. Is that all it takes? Cade asked, crouching down beside her, close enough that she caught his scent again, that same steady warmth that had unsettled her from the very first day. Understanding what something needs? Usually, Elena said, her hands stilling slightly in the soil. People are more complicated than plants, though. Are they? Something in his tone made her look up fully, meeting his eyes directly for the first time in days, without immediately looking away. There was a softness there she had not seen since arriving, something careful and searching, as though he were trying to understand exactly what she needed, the same way she had just described tending to her garden. Sometimes, Elena admitted quietly, people just need someone to actually pay attention. Most of us don't get that very often. Cade's jaw tightened slightly, and Elena wondered, not for the first time, what exactly had happened to the man before her to leave him, carrying himself with such careful, guarded loneliness, despite ruling an entire kingdom. She had heard the stories about his parents, about the attack that killed them when he was still young, forcing him into leadership before he was fully ready for the weight of it. She had assumed, like most legends, the stories were exaggerated for dramatic effect. Watching him now, kneeling beside her in the dirt, instead of standing above her the way a king should, she began to suspect the loneliness in those stories, at least, had been entirely true. You lost your parents young, she said carefully, not quite a question. Cade's expression flickered, surprised she would bring it up so directly. I was 17, he said after a moment. Rival pack, seeking to expand their territory during a moment of weakness, after my father was injured in a hunting accident. They did not expect a 17-year-old boy to hold the throne as fiercely as he did. That's a lot for anyone to carry alone, Elena said quietly. I was not entirely alone, Cade said, though something in his voice suggested he did not fully believe his own words. Priscilla has advised me since that day. My counsel has served faithfully, but there is a difference between being surrounded by people and having someone who simply wants to understand you, the way you said, without some larger purpose attached to it. Elena said nothing for a moment, letting his words settle between them. She recognized that particular loneliness intimately, the kind that existed even while surrounded by others, the kind she had carried through her entire childhood among a pack that tolerated her presence without ever truly seeing her. Perhaps that recognition was part of what the mate bond meant, some deep, instinctive understanding, between two people who had both spent far too long feeling invisible to everyone around them. "For what it's worth," she said finally, returning her attention to the herbs in front of her, though her voice remained soft. "I understand that feeling better than you might think." Cade watched her for a long moment, something shifting behind his golden eyes, before he reached forward and gently plucked a stray leaf from her hair, his fingers brushing against her temple with a tenderness that made her breath catch unexpectedly. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "that is exactly why the bond chose you." Neither of them spoke again for several minutes, working quietly side by side among the herbs, as the afternoon sun stretched shadows across the garden. And for the first time since arriving at the castle, Elena allowed herself, just slightly, to imagine a version of this story that did not end in tragedy. That peace did not last long. Within a week, word of the king's growing attachment to the Omega girl had spread far beyond the castle walls, reaching the ears of noble families who had long relied on the Ashworth throne's reputation for strict, unbending justice to keep smaller packs in line. A group of 6 lords, led quietly by a sharp-tongued nobleman named Rowan Ashcombe, began meeting privately in the eastern wing of the castle, away from Priscilla's watchful attention. An Omega from a treacherous pack, elevated to the king's private favor, Rowan said one evening, addressing the small gathering in low, careful tones. "If this continues, every minor pack in the kingdom will believe they can violate our treaties and simply send a pretty face to soften the punishment. Our authority becomes a joke." "The king has not officially claimed her," one of the other lords pointed out cautiously. "Perhaps this is simply curiosity. It may pass." "And if it does not," Rowan pressed, "if the bond is real, as the rumors suggest, we cannot allow an unclaimed nobody to become the future Luna of this kingdom. She has no lineage, no standing, nothing to offer beyond whatever fate has apparently decided for reasons none of us can control or predict." The group fell into uneasy agreement, though nobody suggested outright violence, at least not yet. Instead, they began a quieter campaign, spreading doubt through careful whispers among the nobility, suggesting that Elena's presence weakened the kingdom's authority, that the king's judgment had been clouded by something unnatural, that perhaps the girl herself had somehow orchestrated this entire situation to escape her rightful punishment. Priscilla caught wind of the meetings within days, her network of informants throughout the castle more extensive than most people realized. She brought the news to Cade directly, choosing her words carefully as she laid out exactly what was being said behind closed doors. "They are calling her a liability," Priscilla said, watching Cade's expression darken with each word. "Some are suggesting worse. Rowan Ashcombe has influence among the border lords, my king. If he convinces enough of them that your judgment cannot be trusted, it could fracture the unity this kingdom has maintained since your father's time." "Let them talk," Cade said, though his voice carried a dangerous edge beneath its calm surface. "Words change nothing about what has already happened between Elena and myself. Words are rarely just words, when spoken by men with armies at their disposal," Priscilla said quietly. "I am not suggesting you abandon her, my king. I am suggesting you consider how quickly whispers can become something more dangerous, if left unaddressed for too long." Cade said nothing for a long moment, staring out toward the eastern wing where he knew, without needing confirmation, that Rowan Ashcombe and his allies were likely gathering again, at that very moment. He had spent 6 years ruling through strength and certainty, never once allowing his authority to be questioned so openly. The idea that his own feelings, something entirely outside his control, could now be used as a weapon against the stability he had worked so hard to protect, left him with a cold, uncomfortable clarity. That night, walking the corridor toward the east wing as he had every evening that week, Cade found himself intercepted by Rowan directly, the nobleman positioning himself deliberately in the hallway, with 2 of his allies flanking him. "My king," Rowan said, bowing just slightly, more formality than genuine respect. "A word, if you would permit it." "Speak quickly," Cade said, his patience already thin. "The court grows concerned," Rowan said carefully. "An Omega with no standing, from a pack that broke sacred treaty, now walking freely through your gardens, dining from your table. Some wonder if perhaps she has bewitched you somehow, used some forbidden trick to cloud your judgment." Cade's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Choose your next words with great care, Rowan." "I only speak what others are too frightened to say directly," Rowan pressed on, undeterred by the warning in Cade's voice. "If this is truly a mate bond, as rumors suggest, then perhaps it would be wise to have it verified officially, before the court, rather than allowing speculation to fester unchecked. Otherwise, my king, I fear some may take matters into their own hands regarding the girl's continued presence here. The threat, thinly veiled beneath careful courtly language, landed exactly as intended. Cade stepped closer, close enough that Rowan's two allies shifted uneasily, sensing the barely restrained fury radiating off their king. If a single hair on her head is harmed, Cade said, his voice dropping to something low and lethal, I will not require a court hearing to determine who is responsible, nor will I require one to decide their punishment. Rowan's confident expression faltered slightly, though he recovered quickly, bowing once more, before stepping aside to let Cade pass. But the message had been delivered clearly enough on both sides. Whatever peace Cade and Elena had begun building quietly in the castle gardens now existed under an entirely new kind of threat, one that would require far more than careful words to resolve. Priscilla, unwilling to let the matter rest, began quietly investigating the circumstances surrounding Elena's selection as the Whitmore Pack's peace offering, suspecting there was more to the story than a simple, panicked decision by frightened elders. Her instincts proved correct within days. A messenger intercepted near the northern border carried a sealed letter addressed to Elder Garrick, written by a rival pack leader named Corwin Hale, whose territory bordered both the Whitmore lands and the Ashworth Kingdom itself. The letter, once decoded and translated by Priscilla's most trusted scholars, revealed something far darker than a simple treaty violation. Corwin Hale had deliberately provoked the hunting dispute months earlier, manipulating Whitmore hunters into crossing the border through false information about shifting territory lines, all in an effort to force a confrontation between the Whitmore Pack and the powerful Ashworth throne. His true goal was never punishment or peace. He wanted war, a conflict that would weaken both packs enough for his own smaller territory to expand into the chaos left behind. Worse still, the letter revealed that Elder Garrick had known, at least in part, that the dispute had been manipulated, yet chose to send Elena as an offering anyway, rather than risk exposing the truth and admitting his own pack's hunters had been deceived. Sacrificing an unwanted Omega was simpler, safer, and far less politically damaging than acknowledging their own failure to protect their borders properly. Elena had not simply been chosen out of convenience. She had been sacrificed to hide a deeper act of cowardice and manipulation that her own elders refused to answer for honestly. Priscilla brought the discovery to Cade immediately, watching his expression shift from confusion to controlled fury as he read through the translated letter twice, then a third time, as though needing to confirm the words had not somehow changed between readings. They knew, Cade said quietly, his voice dangerously calm in the way that Priscilla had learned, over many years, to fear more than shouting. They knew the dispute was manufactured, and rather than admit their own failure, they sent an innocent girl to die in their place. It appears so, my king, Priscilla confirmed. Corwin Hale sought to weaken both our kingdom and the Whitmore Pack simultaneously. Whether he expected you to execute Elena, or simply hoped the confrontation itself would spark greater conflict between our territories, I cannot say for certain. But the manipulation runs deeper than anyone initially suspected. Cade set the letter down carefully, his hands trembling slightly with restrained anger. Does Elena know any of this? Not yet, Priscilla said. I thought it best you decide how and when to tell her. That evening, Cade found Elena in the garden again, kneeling among flowers that had begun to flourish under her careful attention over the past week. She looked up at his approach, immediately sensing something had shifted in his expression, some heaviness he had not carried during their previous visits. What's wrong? She asked, rising to her feet, brushing dirt from her hands. Cade hesitated only a moment before explaining everything Priscilla had uncovered, watching carefully as Elena's expression moved through confusion, then disbelief, then a slow, devastating understanding as the full weight of her own pack's betrayal settled fully into place. It was one thing to know her elders had chosen her because she was expendable. It was another thing entirely to learn they had known the entire dispute was manufactured, that innocent lives on both sides had been endangered to hide their own failure, and that she had been sent to die, not for justice, but to cover up a lie. They knew, Elena repeated softly, echoing Cade's earlier words, her voice cracking slightly on the second word. They knew it wasn't even a real violation. Not really. And they still sent me here anyway. Elena. Cade stepped closer, reaching for her hands before stopping himself, uncertain if she wanted comfort or space in this moment. She answered the question herself, closing the remaining distance and pressing her forehead against his chest, her shoulders shaking with quiet, exhausted grief that had clearly been building since long before she arrived at his castle. I always knew they didn't value me, she whispered against him. I just didn't understand how little, until now. Cade wrapped his arms around her carefully, holding her steady while she processed the full weight of her own pack's betrayal, his jaw tight, with barely restrained fury, toward people who had used her so callously, who had treated her entire life as an acceptable cost for their own cowardice and pride. You are not expendable, he said quietly, his voice fierce despite its softness. Not to me, and not any longer to anyone within these walls. Whatever your pack believed about your worth, Elena, I promise you, they were wrong, and they will answer for what they have done. Elena lifted her head slightly, searching his face for any hint of hesitation or doubt, finding none. For the first time since her name had been read aloud in that meeting hall 3 days before her journey began, she allowed herself to believe, fully and without reservation, that perhaps her life was not simply a debt to be paid by others, but something worth protecting on its own merit. Word of Corwin Hale's manipulation spread through the castle within days, deliberately released by Priscilla under Cade's direct order, ensuring every noble who had questioned Elena's presence now understood the truth behind her arrival. The revelation shifted the court's mood considerably, though Rowan Ashcombe and his small circle of allies remained unconvinced that the girl's innocence in the treaty dispute changed anything about her suitability to stand beside the throne. Cade decided the matter required a definitive response, one that would silence doubt permanently, rather than allow whispers to continue festering in dark corners of the castle. He called for a full gathering of the court, nobles and advisors alike, summoned to the throne room 3 days later, under the pretense of receiving an official update regarding the Northern Treaty investigation. Elena stood nervously in the corridor outside the throne room that morning, wearing a gown Margaret had helped her select, deep blue fabric that Margaret insisted matched Elena's eyes perfectly, though Elena suspected the older woman simply wanted to see her looking her best, for whatever Cade intended to announce that day. Nobody had told her exactly what to expect, only that her presence had been requested, and that she should be prepared for anything. You look every bit as strong as you are, Margaret said, adjusting the fabric at Elena's shoulders one final time. Whatever happens in there today, remember that. The enormous doors swung open, and Elena walked forward once more down that same long stretch of red carpet, though everything about this walk felt entirely different from her first terrified journey toward the throne. She kept her chin lifted, her shoulders squared, meeting the curious stares of gathered nobles without flinching, no longer the frightened, condemned girl who had knelt on cold stone expecting execution. Cade rose from his throne as she approached, descending the steps to meet her partway, extending his hand openly in front of the entire assembled court. Elena took it without hesitation, and a ripple of murmurs swept through the gathered nobles at the deliberate, public gesture. 3 weeks ago, Cade began, his voice carrying easily across the silent throne room, this woman arrived at my castle, sent by her own pack elders as a peace offering, expected by everyone present to pay with her life for a crime she did not commit. Since that day, many of you have questioned my judgment regarding her continued presence here. He paused, his eyes sweeping deliberately across the crowd until they landed briefly on Rowan Ashcombe, who stood rigid near the front of the gathering, his expression carefully neutral despite the obvious tension in his shoulders. I will not pretend the mate bond is a small thing, easily dismissed or ignored, Cade continued. From the moment Elena Whitmore lifted her eyes to mine, in this very room, I understood exactly what fate had decided, regardless of whether it was convenient or expected. I have spent these past weeks confirming what I already knew in my heart from that first instant, and I will not spend one more day pretending otherwise for the sake of political comfort. He turned to face Elena directly, still holding her hand, his expression open and unguarded in a way she had never seen him display before the court. Elena Whitmore, he said, loud enough for every corner of the throne room to hear clearly. Before this court, and before the ancestors who built this kingdom, I claim you as my fated mate, and I ask that you accept the title of Luna, ruling beside me, as my equal in all things. The throne room fell into stunned silence, dozens of nobles exchanging glances, uncertain how to react to such a direct, unprecedented declaration. Elena's heart pounded, though this time the feeling carried none of the terror from her first visit to this room. She looked up at Cade, searching his face one final time for any trace of doubt, finding only steady, unwavering certainty. "I accept," she said, her voice clear and strong enough to carry across the silent hall. A collective exhale swept through the gathered court, some nobles bowing immediately in acceptance, others exchanging uneasy glances but remaining silent in the face of their king's clear, unshakable resolve. Rowan Ashcombe's jaw tightened visibly, though he offered no further protest, understanding clearly that whatever ground he had hoped to gain through quiet manipulation had just been decisively lost in front of the entire kingdom's assembled nobility. Priscilla, standing near the throne, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile as she watched the formal claiming unfold exactly as she had privately hoped it might. Whatever political complications remained to be addressed, at least the matter of Elena's place within the castle had now been settled beyond any further question or doubt. Cade lifted Elena's hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles, sealing the declaration in front of witnesses, who would carry word of this moment throughout every corner of the kingdom by nightfall. Elena felt something settle deep within her chest, a certainty as powerful and undeniable as the bond itself, the quiet, steady knowledge that whatever challenges remained ahead, she would no longer face them alone. The weeks that followed brought Elena face to face with an entirely new set of challenges, learning the responsibilities that came with standing as Luna beside the Alpha King. She spent long hours with Priscilla, studying the kingdom's laws, its history, the delicate balance of relationships between the many packs under Ashworth protection. She made mistakes, stumbled over unfamiliar customs, and occasionally felt the weight of noble eyes judging her every move, but she no longer flinched beneath that scrutiny the way she once had. Rowan Ashcombe, unwilling to accept his defeat quietly, made one final attempt to undermine the new Luna's position, reaching out secretly to Corwin Hale's remaining allies, in hopes of orchestrating a border incident that could be blamed on Elena's supposed inexperience and used to question her fitness to rule. Priscilla's network of informants caught wind of the scheme almost immediately, alerting Cade before the plan could progress beyond its earliest stages. Cade confronted Rowan privately, without the theater of a full court gathering this time, meeting him instead in a quiet chamber, with only Priscilla present as witness. "I warned you once about the consequences of threatening what belongs to me," Cade said, his voice carrying a cold, controlled fury that left no room for negotiation. "You have chosen to test that warning a second time, despite every opportunity to accept what the entire court has already accepted." Rowan's confidence finally cracked under the weight of Cade's unwavering gaze, his carefully constructed arguments collapsing into stammered justifications that convinced no one in the room. "My king, I only sought to protect the kingdom's stability." "You sought to protect your own influence," Cade corrected sharply, "at the expense of a woman who has done nothing but prove herself worthy of the position she now holds, time and time again, despite every obstacle placed deliberately in her path." Given the evidence Priscilla had gathered, Rowan's continued conspiracy against the throne left Cade little choice but to strip him of his noble title and lands, exiling him from Ashworth territory entirely, a punishment far more merciful than the fate he might have received under a less patient king. Rowan departed the castle quietly within days, his small circle of allies scattering to avoid similar consequences, and with his departure, the last significant resistance to Elena's position finally dissolved. Meanwhile, word reached the castle that Elder Garrick and the remaining Whitmore Pack leadership had been formally confronted by neighboring pack representatives regarding their role in covering up Corwin Hale's manipulation. Rather than face the political and social consequences of their cowardice becoming widely known, several elders chose to step down from leadership entirely, allowing younger, more honest voices within the pack to take their place. Elena, informed of these developments by Priscilla, felt a complicated mixture of relief and quiet vindication, though she harbored no desire for further revenge against people who had already lost so much through their own choices. On a clear autumn morning, months after her arrival as a condemned prisoner, Elena stood on the same balcony where Cade had first visited her following the throne room confrontation, now dressed in the formal deep red and black colors of the Ashworth household, watching the gardens below that she had personally helped restore to full, vibrant life. Cade joined her quietly, wrapping an arm around her waist, resting his chin lightly against the top of her head. "Regrets?" he asked softly, echoing a question he had asked her once before during those uncertain early days. "None," Elena said, leaning back against him, watching sunlight spill across the flowers she had nursed back to health with her own hands. "I came here, expecting to die for a crime that was never truly mine, sent by people who valued my life less than their own comfort. Instead, I found something I never expected to have at all." "And what is that?" Cade asked, though something in his voice suggested he already knew the answer. "A place where I finally matter," Elena said quietly, turning in his arms to face him fully. "Not because of what I can offer, or what debt I can pay, but simply because of who I am." Cade smiled, a rare, unguarded expression that few beyond Elena ever had the privilege of witnessing, and pressed a gentle kiss against her forehead. "You have always mattered, Elena. It simply took the rest of the world a little longer to recognize what I understood the very moment you looked into my eyes." Below them, the kingdom continued its steady rhythm. Guards patrolling the walls, servants tending to daily duties, nobles adjusting slowly but surely to the reality of a Luna who had risen from condemned prisoner to trusted, capable ruler, through nothing more than her own quiet strength and unwavering integrity. The girl once sent to die within these castle walls had instead become its most steadfast protector, standing firmly beside the Alpha King, not out of obligation or fear, but out of a bond neither of them had chosen, yet both had come to cherish beyond anything they had known before. And as the autumn sun rose fully over the Ashworth kingdom, casting warm golden light across towers that had once represented nothing but terror and uncertainty to a frightened girl in a prisoner's wagon, Elena Whitmore finally allowed herself to believe, completely and without reservation, that her story, once destined to end in tragedy, had instead only just begun.